The boy didn't speak, but he drew a house with smoke rising, a field wide as hope, and a man. There was once an old man who lived alone for 7 years, and each morning he brewed 2 cups of coffee, yet only drank 1. Then one day a boy sold like a piece of livestock appeared at his gate. He said nothing. The story began in that silence and would end in a warmth no one expected. The sky hadn't quite woken. A thin layer of indigo cloaked the far hills, cold as a breast that had never held a child. Highland wind slipped through rotted fence slats, whispered past a pile of hay left untied, then nudged the porch door till it creaked, a sound like someone sighing alone. In the old kitchen, fire cracked in a cast-iron stove. The smell of roasted coffee rose like a greeting with no one left to answer. Harlan Cole poured boiling water into a tin kettle. His hands didn't tremble, but they weren't sure of themselves either. He moved slowly, as if speeding up might allow memory to catch him. 2 ceramic cups were set on the wooden porch table, right where the morning sun would land. 1 cup for him, the other left untouched. The second cup never steamed for long. No lips had met it in 7 years. There was no conversation. No one to ask, is the wind any gentler today? Only the clink of a loose chain brushing the porch beam. An old horse stood tied there. Hadn't wandered, hadn't asked to go, just like its master. Harlan sat down in a weathered wooden chair that once had 2 armrests. One had broken off. In front of him lay bare earth, and beyond that, the ridge, burnt red like a wound refusing to heal. He sat upright, holding his cup with both hands, not for warmth, but to keep from dropping the last habit. He still had strength to keep. No one knew why he kept brewing 2 cups, and no one dared ask. But if you ever rode past Cole Ranch in those early hours, you might have seen a man sipping coffee with a ghost. Behind him stood a squat 3-room cabin, its brown wood dulled with years, the roof leaning into the wind. There were no flowers, no tablecloth, no signs that someone had once tried to make this place beautiful. Only a slanted black-and-white photograph on the wall and a dead potted plant he hadn't brought himself to throw out. Dawn light crept up the steps and slowly reached the edge of the table. It touched the second cup. No hand moved to shield it. The cattle stirred in the distance. They scattered toward worn paths, their hooves scraping dry stone like brittle bones. Harlan didn't rise. He looked at the untouched cup, not to drink, not to pour it out, not to speak, just looked. And in that moment, his eyes, for the only time each day, seemed not to gaze toward where he still lived, but toward what he had lost. Some say he once had a family, a wife with hair red as desert dusk, and a daughter whose laughter made the neighbors say, "That child's giggle could make the late blooming flowers come early." Then the sickness came, and the light in the east room went out. Forever. Now only the wind remains, and the sound of cooling coffee, and a man who brews 2 cups each morning, not to drink, but so he does not forget. Some doors don't need locks, and yet no one steps through them. The east room of Harlan's house was one such place. It sat at the end of a wooden hallway, where afternoon light had never once reached. The door frame, once white, had yellowed with time, its brass handle dulled to the color of forgetting. A pale blue ribbon, once tied in a neat bow around that handle, had faded almost to nothing, blending now with the grain of the wood. Harlan never opened that door. He didn't forbid it. He didn't touch it. He simply let it be, the way someone might leave a song unfinished. Not because it wasn't beautiful, but because they no longer had the strength to hear it again. Every time he passed down that hall, his steps slowed. A worn reflex, like he was waiting to hear laughter echo from behind the door. But nothing ever came. Only the wind, dry, aged, and empty of memory. Once, 3 winters ago, a sparrow flew in, lost. It panicked, thrashed against the windows, then dropped onto the hallway floor and slipped itself into the crack beneath the east room's door. Harlan sat there for hours, cross-legged on the boards, not daring to move it, not chasing it off. Only when night fell and the bird had died, of hunger or loneliness he couldn't say, did he take a shovel and carry it out. He didn't bury it, just laid it down under the bush near the old well, where his wife had once planted lavender. After that, he avoided the hallway altogether when evening came. Inside that room, a whole world had sealed itself shut. A small bed, no sheets, a wooden rocking horse with a broken ear, worn down from too many joyous rides, a faded pink quilt with the letter J hand-stitched in one corner, crookedly, likely by a hand still learning how to sew. On the far wall, pencil marks tracking a child's height. Blurry now. No more names, no more lines. Harlan never touched any of it, didn't cover the bed, didn't dust the shelves, didn't let renters near, and never spoke of the room to anyone. To him, it wasn't a place to live. It was evidence, proof that laughter had once lived here, that someone had once run, once breathed soft into the night. But it was all taken, not by bullet but by fever, a silent plague. A nightmare that came without screaming. That winter Mrs. Cole had held the girl in her lap. Her eyes had lost all color by then, just still pale pools of grief. Harlan couldn't recall every word that was said, only remembered the small hand gripping his shirt so tight, and then letting go. From that day on, he never opened the room again, and from that day on, the house held no more laughter, only the sound of hooves, clinking against dry earth, the creak of hinges when the wind changed, the stir of a spoon in a single cup of coffee, and silence, the kind that weighs heavier than any weeping ever could. It was market day in Dry Willow, Arizona, the year 1872. Dust rose the moment sunlight crested the southern hills. After the Civil War, such markets had sprung up across the territory, where folks bartered everything from rusted guns to nameless fates. Horses shifted restlessly on dry soil, wagons groaned, and the air hung thick with sweat, hay, and iron. At the center square, once a resting post for westbound wagon trains, now stood an auction platform. Atop it sat a fraying wicker basket, handle snapped. Inside lay a baby boy, 6 months old at most. He did not cry, didn't stir, didn't even blink. A man in a dented felt hat, holding a small whip, called out to the crowd, "Strong stock!" No sickness. Mute, so he's easy to train, perfect for long-term labor. Laughter scattered through the crowd. A woman veiled her face. Someone tossed a coin on the wood floor for sport. One voice called out, "Whose kid is he?" No one answered. Only this was known. His mother, likely a migrant girl from the east, had died on the road westward, leaving the child behind like excess freight. Because he made no noise, folks easily forgot he was still alive. Harlan Cole was there. He stood on the edge of the crowd, dust coat hanging heavy, gloves worn through at the fingers. His horse was tied beneath a dying tree. He hadn't come to trade that day. He only stood, quiet. Eyes began to turn toward him. Everyone knew Harlan had land. He had money, dried meat packed deep in the cellar. He lived alone. He'd once lost a child. An old woman whispered, "If there's a shred of heart left in him, he'll take the boy. That child ain't so different from the little girl he lost." But the baby didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Harlan. Not with pleading, not with fear, just present, as if he already understood. This was the only man left who could decide if he would live or not. That moment stretched like a lifetime, and in Harlan's eyes, those same eyes that had watched both wife and daughter lowered into the earth, a flicker passed through, like wind brushing a still lake. Then he turned. Not a word, no change in face, just tipped his hat lower and walked away, slow, certain. "Mr. Cole, don't you ever need someone to talk to? No one worth saving, huh?" Kindness got a price now. Voices flew like sand in the wind, trailing after him. But he didn't stop, and the child still did not cry. He just watched, followed Harlan's figure with his eyes until it vanished past the old loom at the end of the street. Still no pleading, still no blame, still no hope. Only the look of a small mirror, quietly reflecting the abandonment Harlan himself had never dared to name. Harlan didn't look back. His horse walked slow, hooves tapping against cracked red dirt, a sound that once meant homecoming. Now it sounded like departure. The midday sun pressed down on his back, weighting each step with something more than heat. But he didn't stop, didn't falter. His chest didn't heave, but something in his bones was quietly breaking. Behind him, the auctioneer kept calling. The price dropped lower with each breath, as if the worth of the child was dissolving into the road dust. $5, 4, take him, before the sun cooks him dead in that basket. Harlan didn't turn, not because he didn't hear, but because he knew. If he looked one more time, he might not keep walking. The stares followed him like thorns catching on a coat. Some held scorn, some pity, and some quiet hope. A brown-skinned man pushed his hat back, watched Harlan go, and muttered, "There was a time he saved this whole town. Now he can't save one child." A young woman near the bread stall shook her head, dabbed her forehead with a handkerchief, and whispered to no one, "Maybe he's just tired now." But no one knew. Harlan wasn't seeing people, wasn't seeing the market. He only saw his shadow dragging long behind the horse, stretching across the dirt, so far back he couldn't tell anymore if he was walking away from something, or if something had walked away from him. The sky held no clouds on the road home. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm no one expects. Harlan didn't sing, didn't whistle like he used to in springtimes past, just stared ahead, toward the horizon where his land blurred into the barren earth, as if no man had ever lived there at all. When they reached the gate, the horse stopped without a pull on the reins. It, too, knew there was nothing waiting. The gate creaked open. The ranch stood quiet. Cattle grazed. The woodpile still stood where he'd left it that morning. No one waited. No one asked what he'd brought home. Harlan stopped the horse at the porch, but didn't dismount right away. He looked down at the saddle, at the place he'd once tied bundles in other seasons. This time, it was empty. The late sun poured through the doorway. On the table, the shadows of 2 coffee cups stretched long, one with a shallow ring inside, the other untouched. No one drank. No one poured more. For a moment, he stood like a statue not yet finished, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he no longer knew if he had the right to do anything at all. Evening fell fast in the southern hills. Wind swept across the porch like a cold hand brushing past. Harlan stepped inside. He didn't light a lamp, didn't feed the stove. He just wiped his hands with an old rag, then laid it down beside the cup no lips had touched. And like every other night, he walked the hall. But this time, he paused one breath longer outside the east room door. He didn't open it, just stood still. And for the briefest moment, his eyes drifted shut like a man ready for sleep, but afraid to dream. Nightfall in southern Arizona never asked permission. There was no long amber sunset, only a sudden drop of dark blue like someone had thrown a great quilt over the land from the sky. The wind leaned into the grass. It carried the smell of dry soil and the musky trace of old livestock. It slipped through fence slats, through the gaps where time had taken the nails, and let out thin, high whistles like a breath brushing close to the ear. Harlan Cole sat by the window. No lamp, no fire. Only the dim light of a fading moon, just enough to see shadows drift across the warped floorboards as the breeze stirred the curtains. He didn't sleep. Hadn't, not truly, in years. Sleep came to him like a stranger, just passing through, never staying. He heard everything the night had to say, even the sounds that had no shape, an owl's low cry, the soft tap of a hoof against the barn wall, and then something else. Gravel shifting underfoot, a bit of metal brushing against a fence post. A lonely sound, like someone who'd never learned how to walk into another person's life. Dawn was still far off. The air had grown cold in that quiet way it does without warning. Harlan pulled on an extra coat. He didn't turn on the light. He stepped out onto the porch, his eyes drawn to the gate, where a small figure sat curled beside the wooden post. A child. Not crying, not calling out, not moving closer, just sitting there, as if the wind had blown him in from another world, as if, from the moment Harlan had walked away from the auction square, the boy had followed, tracking the path of hooves, the bend in grass, each step a quiet pursuit. In his hands was a small cloth blanket embroidered with the letter J, identical to the one Harlan had left in his daughter's room. It was dirty, frayed, but still folded with care. The boy looked at him, not with pleading, not with anger, just being. A presence so still it said more than any spoken word could. The wind stirred the old chime by the barn, a hollow clatter never forming into music. A horse sneezed once, then quieted again. No cow lowed, no chicken stirred. The world seemed to pause, giving space to the moment when two people, one who had lost everything and one who'd never had anything to lose, faced each other. Harlan said nothing, made no sign, didn't move closer. He only stepped slowly back into the house, as if even his footfall might break the fragile space holding them together. The wooden door closed behind him, not locked, just pulled to, just enough to let wind pass through, and just enough for someone small to understand. If you needed a place not to be turned away, this might not be the end of hope. The sky was still dark, but in Harlan's heart, that night stretched longer than any before, not from fear, but because he had seen something he'd spent 7 years burying, a quiet soul, asking for nothing, demanding nothing, but waiting to see if he still had enough courage to stop walking away. That morning the light took its time. The sun rose reluctantly over the hills, its warmth dulled by mist and the bent branches still aching from the cold night. Harlan opened the porch door like he did every morning. His hand touched the worn wood of the handle, not out of will, but out of habit. As the door creaked open, wind slipped down his collar, and there the boy was, still sitting there, unmoved, unsleeping, just sitting, legs hugged to his chest, head resting on his knees, like a wild thing that had learned to be silent so it wouldn't be seen. Harlan didn't speak, didn't approach. He turned back inside, tossed a few sticks of wood into the cast-iron stove, set the kettle on top, just like always. When the water boiled, he cut a piece of dry cornbread. Nothing soft, nothing sweet, and stepped back outside. He placed the bread on the porch step, didn't look down, didn't say a word. The boy looked up, didn't reach for it, didn't eat, just watched, with eyes that held no waiting, no fear, but the kind of wonder that comes from seeing a kind of person you never knew could exist. Harlan sat down in his usual chair. His coffee cup rested on the right side. The second one, still empty. He didn't pick up the cup, just wrapped his arms around one knee and stared off toward the pale gray fields, where morning light hadn't yet touched. The wind slipped through his coat. It was cold, but not sharp. He exhaled, slow, not deep, not shallow. Just the breath of a man who no longer expected today to be different from yesterday. The boy kept watching. Harlan still didn't return the look. Between them stretched the porch boards, wider than any prairie, as wide as the space between a man who once had a name and a boy who'd never been called by one. As the sun climbed, a rooster crowed from the coop. Off-key tired. That was when Harlan stood, walked inside, and returned with something in his hands. A wool blanket, faded, unscented, but clean. He set it down beside the hay under the porch awning, said nothing, didn't glance down, didn't linger, just a gesture, small but human. When he stepped back inside, he didn't close the door. The hinges creaked again. But this time, it didn't sound like a house sighing. It sounded like someone had finally exhaled after holding in breath for far too long. He didn't know if the boy would touch the blanket, didn't go back to check. But that night, when he stepped out to empty the stove's ash, the blanket was gone from the step. It had been pulled close to the porch beams, and under it, a small shape, curled tight, breathing slow and even, silent as wild grass pushing up through winter ground. Harlan stood watching for a long time, then turned back in and, for the first time, lit the small lantern that hung beside the east window, not to light the way for someone outside, but maybe so the house would remember that someone was out there, not asking for kindness, only asking to be seen. That night, Harlan didn't sleep. Not because the wind blew harder, not because of lowing cattle or a loose tin roof, but because there was a sound, small, so small, like a stray breath brushing against the porch, slipping through the doorframe and settling into the place inside him where he thought everything had long gone quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, a kerosene lamp unlit. The table still bore the faint burn mark from the night his daughter spilled a candle during a thunderstorm. The breeze wandered through a cracked window, carrying with it a scent, something between dry hay, wild grass, and the faint warmth of a child's sleeping breath. And for the first time in 7 years, Harlan turned his head toward the east hallway. He rose slowly. His boots tapped lightly on the floor, each step careful, as though afraid to wake the air itself. At the end of the hall, he placed his hand on the doorknob. It wasn't cold, like he expected. It wasn't even locked. All it took was a slight turn. The room was unchanged. Dust covered everything, but nothing had been disturbed. The wooden rocking horse still tilted its head in weight, its worn handle smooth from too many happy rides. The bed held a thin quilt, the pillow still creased as if a small body had just risen and left it unmade. Faint pencil marks lined the wall, and growth lines, birthdays, maybe, faded now, but standing there as if waiting for another child to begin again. Harlan didn't dust anything. He just opened the window, letting new air move in, pulling a piece of the outside world into a space that had forgotten change. He walked to the small table against the wall. There, a picture frame lay face down. He turned it over. His hands didn't shake, but he drew a deep breath. A black and white photograph. Mrs. Cole smiling, her hand resting on the shoulder of a girl in a polka dot dress. Both faces tilted toward the light, as if they hadn't yet realized it would be their last picture together. Harlan set the frame upright again, then moved to the small altar near the wall. He lit the lamp. A soft yellow glow flickered outward, thin, trembling, but it held. For the first time in 7 years, that light wasn't for morning. It was a beacon, a signal for a child curled outside on the porch that this house just might open again. By morning, when the fog still lingered halfway up the hills, the boy crossed the threshold. He wasn't invited, didn't ask. He simply stepped in, like he had already lived here in dreams he never dared describe. Harlan was out back, sawing lumber, but he heard the footsteps, soft, curious, inside the house. He didn't turn, didn't speak, only sawed slower, and for the first time each stroke of the blade felt like it was being listened to. By noon, he returned. The east room door stood open. The boy was on the floor, his hand gently brushing the face of the wooden horse. Then he climbed on. No laughter, no shouting, just sat there, as if testing how long he'd be allowed to stay before being told to leave. Harlan stood in the doorway a moment, didn't step in, didn't say yes, didn't say no. He simply gave a quiet nod, then turned and walked to the kitchen. When he opened the cupboard to scoop more rice, he placed 2 bowls on the table. No explanation, no reason, just this. That day, 2 people shared lunch. There is a kind of silence in the wilderness, not the kind born of peace, but of something lying in wait. That morning the air held no wind. The cattle stood frozen under low trees, tails still, eyes unblinking. The birds had fallen quiet before dawn. Even the squeak of the weather-worn cartwheel had gone mute. Harlan felt it, not with his eyes, not with his ears, but along the ridge of his spine. A sense born from years of keeping a gun close, a feeling that never fades from men who've stood watch too long. When he stepped out to draw water from the well, he saw hoofprints, fresh, undusted, pressed deep and clean into the dirt. Not packhorse tracks, not the wandering kind from nearby ranchers. These hooves moved straight, deliberate, the kind that belonged to riders with purpose. He returned to the house and said nothing to the boy. The child was sitting under the shade of the porch, drawing shapes into the dirt with a stick. A house, a sun, and 3 round marks, clearly horse tracks. He knew too. No one had to explain. At noon, Harlan saddled up and rode to the northern ridge, a high place where the whole valley could be seen. Under a pale sun, he spotted 3 men on horseback just outside the eastern boundary fence. They didn't speak, didn't approach. They just stood there, like old wolves tasting blood on the wind. Harlan didn't recognize their faces, but he recognized the signs. The way they rode like men who didn't ask directions, the coats draped long enough to hide guns, and the way their horses stood motionless, trained not to betray their presence. No common settler in the territory rode like that, and no one stumbled here by accident. Harlan didn't ride down to greet them. He just watched, still as an old stone clinging to the hillside. He knew the law of these lands. If a stranger didn't cross your fence, you didn't call out his name. But the men weren't looking at him. They weren't looking at the field. Their eyes were fixed on one room in the house, a room with a light that now burned at night, a room that hadn't been opened in 7 years. By dusk, they vanished. No dust trail, no fresh boot prints, only hoof marks, pressed deeper than usual, like punctuation carved into dry earth. That night, Harlan didn't turn off the porch lamp. The boy sat quietly in the east room, drawing with a charcoal stub on butcher's paper. This time he drew 3 tall men, standing beyond a fence. Faceless, nothing happened. But the house itself seemed to lean toward vigilance. Doors were latched, not from fear, but from the slow awareness that something was returning, not from outside, but from the past. And Harlan, while cleaning the chicken coop, picked up the old iron hammer. It felt heavier than he remembered. His grip was still firm, but something in his chest gave a dull ache, not from age, but from knowing what he turned his back on at the town square had found its way to his gate. That morning came cloaked in fog, not cold, but the light couldn't find its way to the porch. It was as if the sun itself hesitated, uncertain whether a day like this deserved to rise at all. Harlan was up before the rooster. He stepped into the old storage shed, where dust and splintered boards had become familiar companions. Behind a stack of hay bales there was a corner covered with a thin goat-hide tarp, dirty but folded with care. He pulled it back, knelt down, and brushed away a thin layer of ash that clung to the floorboards. One small wooden peg rose slightly above the rest, the kind only the man who placed it there would recognize. He pried the board loose. Beneath it, a rusted tin box. edges eaten by time, heavier than memory. When he lifted the lid, a breath of gray dust rose up, the scent of years held prisoner. Inside, a deputy sheriff's badge, tarnished and dulled, its five-pointed star chipped at one tip. A revolver, old and matte, but still clean, still ready. A thin leather notebook, its cover torn, pages inside marked with names long forgotten, and a pale pink handkerchief embroidered with the letter J, like the blanket in the East Room, but smaller, softer, once used to dry the tears of a little girl. Harlan sat back. He didn't cry, didn't tremble. He just sat like a craftsman revisiting old tools, knowing his hands had slowed, but his heart had not. He picked up the badge, held it in his palm, not to remember, but to measure whether he still had the strength to bear what it meant again. Footsteps, small, careful. The boy stood at the doorway of the shed. He didn't speak, didn't ask, just watched. Those dark, quiet eyes, deep as a lake, untouched by wind. Harlan gently closed the box, rose to his feet. He didn't hide it, didn't offer it. He only stepped forward and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Lightly, just enough to say, someone in this house is finally ready to face what they once buried. That afternoon, Harlan fixed the door latch, retied the wind chime string, secured the netting behind the shed. Small things, unspoken, unnoticed by most, but each act declared this truth. The man was no longer living just to endure. He was living to protect something, something small perhaps. But this time he would not let it slip away. That night he placed the badge on the table, not pinned to his coat, just resting there, beside the oil lamp, freshly cleaned and refilled, and in the flicker of that small flame, the old silver star glowed softly, like a vow whispered into the dark. The third night since the boy arrived, the sky held no stars, only a crescent moon, thin as a claw, hung low, casting just enough light to stretch shadows long across the earth. Harlan did not sleep. The kitchen window was cracked open a finger's width. On the table his revolver lay loaded, not to be fired, but to be ready. He sat behind the curtain. The oil lamp was dark now, but the coals in the stove still glowed faint, like a heart not yet willing to go quiet. The sound of hooves crept close. They stopped at the edge of the ranch. The northern fence, long left unrepaired. Posts splintered, chains rusted through. A stranger might walk around. Someone who knew the land would choose that path, the one that entered quiet. Harlan heard them, murmurs short, low, voices he didn't recognize, a laugh, soft, sharp, like a stone dropped into a dry well. Then silence. The wind crossed the pasture carrying scents of horse sweat, rusted iron, and men who hadn't bathed in days. Harlan took the gun, stepped onto the porch. He didn't light a lamp, didn't call out, didn't need to. 3 shadows stood there, 3 men, no names, no greetings, no badges, no banners, but their eyes held no questions. They already knew this was the place. The one in the center was taller than the others. Broad shoulders, a broken nose. His hand rested on the hilt of a knife. Not in threat, but the way a man rests where his instincts live. They didn't climb the steps, just stood at the base of the porch, close enough to see the faint glow of a light, just extinguished in the east room. Close enough to know the house wasn't holding just one man anymore. Harlan said nothing. He laid his hand on the porch rail, firm, steady, and looked straight at them like an old man watches a coming storm. Not fearful, not apologetic, just ready. The silence stretched until the third man cleared his throat, as if to remind them, "We're still here." Inside the east room, the boy did not cry, didn't rise. He simply lay still, clutching the handkerchief stitched with the letter J. as if he'd known all along this night would come. The tall man finally spoke. His voice was sand against tin. "There's something that wandered onto your land. We're only here to bring it back where it came from." It wasn't a question, no threat, just a statement, like a sentence read aloud in the dark. Harlan didn't answer. He tapped his fingers twice on the railing, once for the past, once for the child asleep in the room where his wife once sang lullabies. The man stepped forward, a foot lifted to the first porch step, and that's when Harlan raised the gun. He didn't aim, just held it steady. Why? Arm outstretched like the reach of a memory that refused to die. "I may not wear the badge anymore," he said, his voice the first sound since they arrived. "But my hands still remember how to guard a life when it matters." The three men paused. A glance, a breath, then they turned, like shadows peeling away from a wall. No whinnies from the horses, no footsteps in the dust. Only the imprint of hooves, deeper than before, left behind for those who ever thought of coming back. The ranch gate creaked shut. The wind pulled Harlan's coat behind him as he stood. In his eyes, no triumph. Only another fracture added to what was already cracked. He stepped back inside, down the wooden hall. The door to the east room stood slightly open. The boy sat up, eyes wide. He didn't ask. Didn't need to. Harlan walked to him and pulled the thin blanket higher over his shoulders. No one slept fully that night, meant for no ears but one's own. A standoff without gunfire. But enough to frighten the living dawn didn't come quickly. The sky hung dull and leaden, as if the world waited for someone to decide whether light was deserved at all. Harlan stayed home, didn't lock the door. He sat at the kitchen table, cold coffee in hand, gazing out across the fields toward where the three figures had vanished the night before. Inside, Jonah still slept. The east room glowed with the soft gray of a hesitant morning. On the child's small table, a charcoal sketch, a man standing beside a child. Behind them, a house with smoke curling from the chimney. By late afternoon, wind stirred again. Harlan stepped out back, carrying a rope, a lantern, and a rusted shovel. He didn't speak, didn't leave a note, just began to dig. The old well had long since run dry. Its mouth was choked with weeds, like a memory buried so no one could reach it. He cleared the brush, scooped out fallen stones, lowered the lantern in. Its flickering light caught fresh boot tracks pressed into the dirt path nearby. 3 sets. Deep. Recent. Harlan knew they'd be back. Not politely, the 4th night. Moon hidden behind cloud. No dogs barked. They were long gone from these parts. Harlan crouched behind the old chicken shed, gripping a sharpened cattle prod. Not a weapon, just something to keep him from touching a gun. At least at first. He waited. The footsteps came just before dawn, not hurried, not cautious. They moved like men, certain their presence inspired fear. The first entered the yard, broken nose, leading. The second slipped the gate latch. The third carried a burlap sack, empty but menacing like a snare. They didn't see Harlan, not until the leader stepped near the well. A sharp crack. His leg vanished beneath him, snared in the shallow pit Harlan had dug that morning. He cried out. The first sound to shatter the silence. The other two rushed forward, but from the darkness of the shed, Harlan emerged. Swift and silent, a shadow with a cane. He swung once across the skull of the second man. He crumpled to the sand, alive, but likely unsure of who he was anymore. The third man reached for a blade, but then, clang! A tin can flew from the porch, striking the back of his head. Jonah stood there. No words. No tremble, just eyes locked on Harlan as if to say, I'm here too. Harlan blinked, but didn't pause. He advanced, wrestled the knife away, dragged the man across the yard like a sack of old grain. No blood spilled, no one died, just a man who once wore a badge, and a boy who'd never spoken a word, choosing, together, to stand. By daylight, Harlan tied the 3 horses together, bound the men's wrists to their saddles. He led them to the edge of the desert. He said nothing. Left behind 3 small water pouches, a rusted knife, and one sentence: "Any man who seeks power by preying on children ought to learn how to survive like an animal first." Then he turned and walked home, his boots dragging through dried blood. Not much, but enough to prove silence is not weakness. Jonah stood on the porch when he returned, unshaken, uncurious. He stepped forward, touched Harlan's hand, then turned and walked inside. Harlan looked down. Blood clung beneath his nails. No tremble, no regret. Only a sigh, the kind a heart makes when it's done what it didn't want to, but knew it must. At Harlan's ranch, dawn always arrived in silence, as if no one had ever lived there at all. Only the wind threading through the fences, the faint clink of a rusted chain swaying at the horse trough. Sunlight poured across the wooden floor without asking, gliding past the wool-covered chair, pausing at the embroidered J neatly folded atop the bed. That morning the boy rose earlier than usual. He didn't run, didn't knock. He simply picked up a blackened bit of charcoal, the kind they used to mark bales of hay, and sat down near the wall by the old cook stove. Harlan was slicing dried beef when he heard the soft scratch, like a fingernail drawn across skin. He turned, didn't speak, just watched. The boy didn't look back. His hand moved steadily, lifting and lowering the charcoal in rhythm, as if these images had lived inside his mind for a long time, waiting only for permission to surface. The drawing was small, not refined. The lines were uncertain, faint in places where his grip wavered, but it made Harlan stand still. A simple cabin, rough lines. Smoke rose from the roof, darkened by 3 smudged circles. Below it, a man, wearing a hat, holding something like a coffee cup. Beside him a child, smaller, faceless, but with one hand resting in the man's. Farther off another figure, faded, distant, drawn like a memory unwilling to be remembered. A woman, long hair, standing beside a burned wagon, arms wrapped around a small shape. Harlan stared at it. His breath caught. The boy didn't explain. He didn't have to. The trembling lines said enough. He didn't speak, because fire had stolen the voice that once answered to his name. When he finished, he placed the charcoal on the floor, didn't turn around, just walked outside and sat under the sun. Harlan took a seat on the bench, facing the drawing. He didn't ask, "Is that someone you knew?" Didn't say, "Do you want to stay here?" Because he already knew. When a child who has no voice chooses to draw the place they want to belong and includes their deepest wound inside it, no grown man needs to say anything more. Harlan stood. From the loft he took down an old wooden frame, once used to post wildfire warnings. He lined it with a scrap of old hide, fitted the drawing inside, and hung it on the wall beside the stove, in the very spot where morning light first arrived. No one said what the picture was. No one told the boy, "Good job," because in the West some things live longer when left unnamed. That afternoon Harlan brewed 2 cups of coffee, set the second on the table. Same as always, but for the first time the boy reached for it, didn't drink, just held it with both small hands. They sat in silence, no glances, no words. The wind passed through the porch. A dry leaf drifted down, landing in the boy's hand. He didn't flinch. Maybe that day he began to believe this was a place he could stay. And Harlan, a man who had once lost everything, began to believe he just might begin again. The next morning the wind stayed still. Under soft light trickling through the old mesquite trees out front, Harlan sat, tightening the saddle straps. The boy crouched nearby, brushing dirt from a horse's hooves. He didn't speak, didn't need instruction. One old, one young, dividing the morning's work like men who had already lived through a long season together. Near noon, Harlan stepped into the old storage shed. The air was thick with mildew, frayed rope, stiff saddles curled at the corners, and rusting mesh wire long past repair. He slipped through the narrow aisle into a darkened corner where an old pile of hay had once been stacked to keep mice out. Beneath it, he pulled free a wooden sign. Its paint faded, the edges dulled by years, carved by hand on the front, barely legible. Refuge, a place of shelter. Once that sign had hung at the front gate when he still wore the deputy's star. Back then, anyone, a beaten woman, a hungry child, a native soul fleeing the bounty men, could knock on his door, and he never asked why. But after the day the East Room went quiet, he'd taken the sign down. There was no reason left to open the door, no one left to protect. Harlan wiped it clean with an old rag. The scratches, the splits in the grain, he didn't sand them down. He made no repairs, only added 2 new nails. That evening, before the sun slipped behind the ridge, he carried the sign to the gate. The boy followed. Didn't ask, didn't understand, but still walked with him. Harlan stood at the wooden gate, the same spot the sign once hung, and he nailed it back up. No speeches, no pitchforks, no rifle slung across his back, just a man who had once let go of everything, now choosing to stand between the road and a roof as a shield for someone else. The townsfolk didn't need anyone to spread the word. By the next morning, hoofprints appeared at the gate and turned away. That afternoon, a bundle of dried tobacco was left on the porch, then a handful of nails, a bag of sugar, a pair of boots smaller than Harlan's size. No knocks, no names, but everyone knew. Refuge was lit again, and when the boy finished drying the coffee cup and ran across the porch, he paused, looked at the freshly hung sign, reached out, touched the edge of the wood. No smile, no tears, just stood still a moment, then kept moving, because even a child who cannot speak knows when he's found a place he can finally call home. Morning, Harlan brewed coffee like he always had, but this time he didn't stare too long at the second cup. He set both mugs down on the wooden table out front, his hand steady now, not trembling like it used to. One for himself, one for the boy, who was crouched, tying the reins of a small horse, sunlight laying gold across his back. The house was no longer silent. There were the footsteps of a child scampering through. The wooden hall, the scratch of charcoal scribbled on walls, the clink of a spoon tapping a tin can, the whistle of a kettle over the flame. The boy still didn't speak. No one asked him to, but every day now he sat in the same chair and sipped from his cup, even if just barely wetting his lips. Sometimes he stared down the road as if waiting for one more person to come. The East Room was opened every night. The small quilt was folded neatly. The old stuffed bear rested on a new shelf. The photograph, a father, a mother, and a smiling girl now gone, had been rehung on the wall, its cracked frame left uncovered. One morning, while Harlan was repairing the porch roof, the boy came near and handed him a sheet of paper. On it, in clumsy block letters, were 3 words: Jonah and Harlan home. Harlan read it silently, said nothing. He folded the paper, slipped it into his shirt pocket, the same one that once carried his old badge. He never asked who taught the boy to write, or where he came up with the name, but he nodded. And from that day forward, if anyone asked, he'd say, "The boy's name is Jonah." No last name, no papers, because in the West some names weren't meant for calling. They were meant to remind that someone who'd once been swallowed by the dark had now been returned, heart still warm. The refuge sign stayed nailed to the gate. dust gathered on it day by day, and yet somehow it always seemed to shine. Maybe it was the sun, maybe the wind, or maybe because now each afternoon on that porch there came a sound, a laugh, small, uneven, still growing into itself, but real and enough. The story ends, not with miracles, but with a man who didn't turn away, and a child who chose to stay.